Hello everyone. I hope you're all taking good care of yourselves today. I think our last storytelling session went so well that I want to include another storytelling session for you all tonight. Last time, I recited one poem and one short story by the legendary literary figure Edgar Allan Poe. We recited The Raven and The Telltale Heart. So if you would like to hear those, feel free to take a look at that video. It's not too far behind from this video. I can also post a link to it in the description. Now, to continue our storytelling session, we are revisiting the website Project Gutenberg, which provides free ebooks all in the public domain. And if you wish to follow along with each of these storytelling sessions, I will post the link in the description below so you can click and follow along. So for now, I have open selections from Poe, starting off with a preface. So this is just going to be some basic biographical information about the legend himself. And I think it would be a nice opportunity for us to get to know one of our favorite writers some more. And for those who hadn't heard of Edgar Allan Poe, this is the perfect opportunity to learn more about some incredible literary figures. So let me go ahead and get started. Preface. Edgar Allan Poe has been the subject of so much controversy that he is the one American writer whom high school pupils, not to mention teachers, are likely to approach with ready-made prejudices. It is impossible to treat such a subject in quite the ordinary matter-of-course way. Furthermore, his writings are so highly subjective and so intimately connected with his strongly held critical theories as to need somewhat careful and extended study. These facts make it very difficult to treat either the man or his art as simply as a desirable in a secondary textbook. Consequently, the introduction is longer and less simple than the editor would desire for the usual text. It is believed, however, that the teacher can take up this introduction with the pupil in such a way as to make it helpful, significant, and interesting. The text of the following poems and tales is that of the Stedman Woodbury edition, and the selections are reprinted by permission by the publishers Duffield and Company. This text is followed exactly except for a very few changes in punctuation, not more than 5 or 6 in all. My obligations to other works are too numerous to mention. All the publications included in the bibliography, besides a number of others, have been examined, but I especially desire to acknowledge the courtesy of Dr. Henry Barton Jacobs of Baltimore, who sent me from Paris a copy of Émilie Lever's interesting and important study, Edgar Poe, Sa vie et son œuvre. I actually can't speak French, so I'm not going to try to pronounce that. To my wife, I am in debt for valuable assistance in the tedious work of reading proofs and verifying the text. All right. So now let's look at the introduction. Edgar Allan Poe, his life, character, and art. Edgar Allan Poe, in many respects, the most fascinating figure in American literature. His life, touched by the extremes of fortune, was on the whole more unhappy than that of any other of our prominent men of letters. His character was strangely complex, and was the subject of misunderstanding during his life and of heated dispute after his death. His writings were long neglected or disparaged at home, while accepted abroad as our greatest literary achievement. Now, after more than half a century has elapsed since his death, careful biographers have furnished a tolerably full account of the real facts about his life. A fairly accurate idea of his character is winning general acceptance, and the name of Edgar Allan Poe has been conceded a place among the 2 or 3 greatest in our literature. Now we're going to talk about his life and his character. In December 1811, a well-known actress of the time died in Richmond, leaving destitute 3 little children, the eldest but 4 years of age. This mother, who was Elizabeth Arnold Poe, daughter of an English actress, had suffered from ill health for several years, and had long found the struggle for existence difficult. Her husband, David Poe, probably died before her. He was a son of General David Poe, a Revolutionary veteran of Baltimore, and had left his home and law books for the stage several years before his marriage. The second of the 3 children, born January 19th, 1809 in Boston, where his parents happened to be playing at the time, was Edgar Poe, the future poet and story writer. Sounds like he was a Capricorn. Okay. The little Edgar was adopted by the wife of Mr. John Allan, a well-to-do Scotch merchant of the city who later became wealthy, and the boy was thereafter known as Edgar Allan Poe. He was a beautiful and precocious child who at 6 years of age could read, draw, dance, and declaim the best poetry with fine effect and appreciation. Report says also that he had been taught to stand on a chair and pledge Mr. Allan's guests in a glass of wine with roguish grace. In 1815, Mr. Allan went to England, where he remained 5 years. Edgar was placed in an old English school in the suburbs of London, among historic, literary, and antiquarian associations, and possibly was taken to the continent by his foster parents at vacation seasons. The English residence and the sea voyages left deep impressions on the boy's sensitive nature. Returning to Richmond, he was prepared in good schools for the University of Virginia, where he entered at the age of 17, pursuing studies in ancient and modern languages and literatures. During this youthful period, he was already developing a striking and peculiar personality. He was brilliant, if not industrious. As a student, leaving the university with highest honors in Latin and French. He was quick and nervous in his movements, and greatly excelled in athletics, especially in swimming. In character, he was reserved, solitary, sensitive, and given to lonely reverie. Some of his aristocratic playmates remembered to his discredit that he was the child of strolling players, and their attitude helped to add a strain of defiance to an already intensely proud nature. Though kindly treated by his foster parents, the strange boy longed for an understanding sympathy that was not his. Once he thought he had found it in Mrs. Jane Stannard, mother of his schoolmate, but the new friend soon died, and for months the grief-stricken boy, it is said, haunted the lonely grave at night and brooded over his loss and the mystery of death, a not very wholesome experience for a lonely and melancholy lad of 15 years. At the university he drank wine, though not intemperately, and played cards a great deal, the end of the term finding him with gambling debts of $2,500. Oh my. These habits were common at the time, and Edgar did not incur any censure from the faculty. But Mr. Allan declined to honor the gambling debt, removed Edgar, and placed him in his own counting room. Such a life was too dull for the high-spirited, poetic youth, and he promptly left his home. Going to Boston, he published a thin volume of boyish verse, Tamerlane, and other poems. But realizing nothing financially, he enlisted in the United States Army as Edgar A. Perry. After 2 years of faithful and efficient service, he procured through Mr. Allan, who was temporarily reconciled to him, an appointment to the West Point Military Academy, entering in July 1830. In the meantime, he had published in Baltimore a second small volume of poems. Fellow students have described him as having a worn, weary, discontented look, usually kindly and courteous, but shy, reserved, and exceedingly sensitive. An extraordinary reader, but noted for carping criticism. Although a good student, he seemed galled beyond endurance by the monotonous routine of military duties, which he deliberately neglected, and thus procured his dismissal from the academy. He left alone and penniless in March 1831. Oh my. Now, going to New York, Poe brought out another little volume of poems showing great improvement. Then he went to Baltimore, and after a precarious struggle of a year or two, turned to prose, and while in great poverty won a prize of $100 from the Baltimore Saturday Visitor for his story, The Manuscript Found in a Bottle. Ironic. Through John P. Kennedy, one of the judges whose friendship the poverty-stricken author gained, he procured a good deal of hack work and finally an editorial position on the Southern Literary Messenger of Richmond. The salary was fair, and better was in sight, yet Poe was melancholy, dissatisfied, and miserable. He wrote a pitiable letter to Mr. Kennedy, asking to be convinced that it is all necessary to live. For several years he had been making his home with an aunt, Mrs. Clem, and her daughter, Virginia, a girl beautiful in character and person, but penniless and probably already a victim of the consumption that was eventually to cause her death. In 1836, when she was only 14 years old, Poe married his cousin, to whom he was passionately attached. His devotion to her lasted through life, and the tenderest affection existed between him and Mrs. Clem, who was all a mother could have been to him, so that the home life was always beautiful in spirit, however poor in material comfort. Now in January 1837, his connection with the messenger was severed, probably because of his occasional lapses from sobriety, but his unfortunate temperament and his restless ambition were doubtless factors. With some reputation as poet, story writer, critic, and editor, Poe removed to New York, and a year later to Philadelphia, where he remained until 1844. Here he found miscellaneous literary, editorial, and hack work, finally becoming editor of Graham's Magazine, which prospered greatly under his management, increasing its circulation from 8,000 to 40,000 within a year. But Poe's restless spirit was dissatisfied. He was intensely anxious to own a magazine for himself, and had already made several unsuccessful efforts to obtain one, efforts which were to be repeated at intervals, and with as little success until the day of his death. He vainly sought a government position, that a livelihood might be assured while he carried out his literary plans. Finally, he left Graham's, doubtless because of personal peculiarities, since his occasional inebriety did not interfere with his work, and there followed a period of wretched poverty, broken once by the winning of a prize of $100 for The Gold Bug. He continued to be known as a reserved, isolated, dreamy man of high, strung nerves, proud spirit, and fantastic moods, with a haunting sense of impending evil. His home was poor and simple, but impressed every visitor by its neatness and quiet refinement. Virginia, accomplished in music and languages, was as devoted to her husband as he was to her. Both were fond of flowers and plants and of household pets. Mrs. Clem gave herself completely to her children and was the business manager of the family. In the spring of 1844, Poe went with Virginia to New York, practically penniless, and to Mrs. Clem, who did not come at once, he wrote with pathetic enthusiasm of the generous meals served at their boarding house. He obtained a position on the Evening Mirror at small pay, but did his dull work faithfully and efficiently. Later, he became editor of the Broadway Journal, in which he printed revisions of his best tales and poems. In 1845 appeared The Raven, which created a profound sensation at home and abroad, and immediately won, and has since retained an immense popularity. He was at the height of his fame, but poor as always. In 1846 he published the Literati, critical comments on the writers of the day, in which the literary small fry were mercilessly condemned and ridiculed. This naturally made Poe a host of enemies. One of these, Thomas Dunn English published an abusive article attacking the author's character, whereupon Poe sued him for libel and obtained $225 in damages. The family now moved to a little 3-room cottage at Fordham, a quiet country place with flowers and trees and pleasant vistas. But illness and poverty were soon there too. In 1841, Virginia had burst a blood vessel while singing, and her life was despaired of. This had happened again and again, leaving her weaker each time. As the summer and fall of this year wore away, she grew worse and needed the tenderest care and attention. But winter drew on, and with it came cold and hunger. The sick girl lay in an unheated room on a straw bed, wrapped in her husband's coat, the husband and mother trying to chafe a little warmth into her hands and feet. Some kind-hearted women relieved the distress in a measure, but on January 30th, 1847, Virginia died. The effect on Poe was terrible. It is easy to see how a very artist of death, who could study the dreadful stages of its slow approach and seek to penetrate the mystery of its ultimate nature with such intense interest and deep reflection as did Poe, must have brooded and suffered during the years of his wife's illness. His own health had long been poor, his brain was diseased, and insanity seemed imminent. After intense grief came a period of settled gloom and haunting fear. The less than 3 years of life left for him was a period of decline in every respect. But he remained in the little cottage, finding some comfort in caring for his flowers and pets, and taking long, solitary rambles. During this time, he thought out and wrote Eureka, a treatise on the structure, laws, and destiny of the universe, which he desired to have regarded as a poem. Poe had always felt a need for the companionship of sympathetic and affectionate women, for whom he entertained a chivalric regard amounting to reverence. After the shock of his wife's death had somewhat worn away, he began to depend for sympathy upon various women with whom he maintained romantic friendships. Judged by ordinary standards, his conduct became at times little short of maudlin. His correspondence assured a sort of gasping, frantic dependence upon the sympathy and consolation of these women friends, and exhibited a painful picture of a broken man. Mrs. Shrew, one of the kind women who had relieved the family at the time of Virginia's last illness, strongly advised him to marry, and he did propose marriage to Mrs. Sarah Helen Whitman, a verse writer of some note in her day. After a wild and exhausting wooing, begun in an extravagantly romantic manner, the match was broken off through the influence of the lady's friends. When it was all over, Poe seemed very little disturbed. The truth is, he was a wreck, and feeling utterly dependent, clutched frantically at every hope of sympathy and consolation. His only real love was for his dead wife, which he recorded shortly before his death in the exquisite lyric, Annabel Lee. In July 1849, full of the darkest forebodings and predicting that he should never return, Poe went to Richmond. Here he spent a few quiet months, part of the time fairly cheerful, but twice yielding to the temptation to drink, and each time suffering in consequence a dangerous illness. On September 30th, he left Richmond for New York with $1,500, the product of a recent lecture arranged by kind Richmond friends. What happened during the next 3 days is an impenetrable mystery. But on October 3rd, on a Wednesday, he was found in an election booth in Baltimore, desperately ill, his money and baggage gone. The most probable story is that he'd been drugged by political workers, imprisoned in a coop with similar victims, and used as a repeater, this procedure being a common one at the time. Whether he was also intoxicated is a matter of doubt. There could be but one effect on his delicate and already diseased brain. He was taken to a hospital unconscious, lingered several days in the delirium of a violent brain fever, and in the early dawn of Sunday, October 7th, breathed his last. The dead author's character immediately became the subject of violent controversy. His severe critical strictures had made him many enemies among the minor writers of the day and their friends. One of the men who had suffered from Poe's too caustic pen was Rufus W. Griswold, but friendly relations had been nominally established, and Poe had authorized Griswold to edit his works. This Griswold did, including a biography which Poe's friends declared a masterpiece of malicious distortion and misrepresentation. It certainly was grossly unfair and inaccurate. Poe's friends retorted, and a long war of words followed, in which hatred or prejudice on the one side and wholesale, undiscriminating laudation on the other, alike tended to obscure the truth. It is now almost impossible to see the real Poe just as he appeared to an ordinary, unprejudiced observer of his own time. Only by the most careful, thoughtful, and sympathetic study can we hope to approximate such an acquaintance. The fundamental fact about Poe is a very peculiar and unhappy temperament, certain characteristic qualities of which began to disclose themselves in early boyhood and fostered by the vicissitudes of his career developed throughout his life. In youth he was nervous, sensitive, morbid, proud, solitary, and wayward. And as the years went by, bringing poverty, illness, and the bitterness of failure, often through his own faults, the man became irritable, impatient, often morose. He had always suffered from fits of depression, blue devils, Mr. Kennedy called them, and though he was extravagantly sanguine at times, melancholy was his usual mood, often manifesting itself in a haunting fear of evil to come. The peculiar character of his wonderful imagination made actual life less real to him than his own land of dreams. The distant Eden, the dim lake of Auburn, the kingdom by the sea, seemed more genuine than the landscapes of earth. The lurid city in the sea, more substantial than the streets he daily walked. Because of this intensely subjective and self-absorbed character of mind, he had no understanding of human nature, no insight into character with its marvelous complexities and contradictions. With these limitations, Poe, as might be expected, had a very defective sense of humor, lacked true sympathy, was tactless, possessed little business ability, and was excessively annoyed by the dull routine and rude frictions of ordinary life. He was always touched by kindness, but was quick to resent an injury, and even as a boy could not endure a jest at his expense. He had many warm and devoted friends whom he loved in return, but the limitations of his own nature probably made a really frank, unreserved friendship impossible. And when a break occurred, he was apt to assume that his former friend was an utter villain. These personal characteristics, in conjunction with a goading ambition, which took form in the idea of an independent journal of his own, in which he might find untrammeled expression, added uneasiness and restlessness to a constantly discontented nature. To some extent, at least, Poe realized the curse of such a temperament, but he strove vainly against its impulses. The one genuine human happiness of this sad life was found in a singularly beautiful home atmosphere. Husband and wife were passionately devoted to each other, and Mrs. Clem was more than a mother to both. She says of her son-in-law, "At home he was simple and affectionate as a child, and during all the years he lived with me, I do not remember a single night that he failed to come and kiss his mother, as he called me, before going to bed." This faithful woman remained devoted to him after Virginia's death, and to his memory, when calumny assailed it after his own. The capital charge against Poe's character has been intemperance, and although the matter has been grossly exaggerated and misrepresented, the charge is true. Except for short periods, he was never what is known as dissipated, and he struggled desperately against his weakness, an unequal struggle, since the craving was inherited and fostered by environment, circumstances, and temperament. One of his biographers tells of bread soaked in gin being fed to the little Poe children by an old nurse during the illness of their mother, and there is another story already mentioned of the little Edgar in his adopted home, taught to pledge the guests as a social grace. Drinking was common at the time. Wine was offered in every home and at every social function, and in the South, where Poe spent his youth and early manhood, the spirit of hospitality and conviviality held out constant temptation. To his delicate organization, strong drink early became a veritable poison, and indulgence that would have been a small matter to another man was ruinous to him. Indeed, a single glass of wine drove him practically insane, and a debauch was sure to follow. Indulgence was stimulated also by the nervous strain and worry induced by uncertain livelihood and privation, the frequent fits of depression, and by constant brooding. Sometimes he fought his weakness successfully for several years, but always it conquered in the end. Moreover, he speaks of a very special cause in the latter part of his life, which in fairness should be heard in his own written words to a friend. 6 years ago, a wife whom I loved as no man ever loved before, ruptured a blood vessel in sinking. Her life was despaired of. I took leave of her forever and underwent all the agonies of her death. She recovered partially, and I again hoped. At the end of a year the vessel broke again. I went through precisely the same scene, then again, and even once again, at varying intervals. Each time I felt all the agonies of her death, and at each accession of her disorder I loved her more dearly, and clung to her life with more desperate pertinacity. But I am constitutionally sensitive, nervous in a very unusual degree. I became insane, with long intervals of horrible sanity. During these fits of absolute unconsciousness I drank. God only knows how often or how much. As a matter of course, my enemies referred the insanity to the drink, rather than the drink to the insanity. It was the horrible, never-ending oscillation between hope and despair, which I could not have endured without the total loss of reason. In the death of what was my life then, I received a new, but oh God, how melancholy an existence. End quote. This statement and the other facts mentioned are not offered as wholly excusing Poe. Doubtless a stronger man would have resisted. Doubtless a less self-absorbed man would have thought of his wife's happiness as well as of his own relief from torture. Yet the fair-minded person, familiar with Poe's unhappy life, and keeping in mind the influence of heredity, temperament, and environment, will hesitate to pronounce a severe judgment. Poe was also accused of untruthfulness, and this accusation likewise has a basis of fact. He repeatedly furnished or approved statements regarding his life and work that were incorrect. He often made a disingenuous show of pretended learning, and he sometimes misstated facts to avoid wounding his own vanity. This ugly fault seems to have resulted from a fondness for romantic posing, and is doubtless related to the peculiar character of imagination already mentioned. Perhaps, too, he inherited from his actor parents a love of applause, and if so, the trait was certainly encouraged in early childhood. There is no evidence that he was ever guilty of malicious or mercenary falsehood. Another of his bad habits was borrowing, but it must be remembered that his life was long struggle with grinding poverty, that he and those dear to him sometimes suffered actual hunger and cold. Many who knew him testified to his anxiety to pay all his debts. Mr. Graham referring to him in this particular as the soul of honor. In a letter to Lowell, Poe has well described himself in a sentence. My life has been whim, impulse, passion, a longing for solitude, a scorn of all things present, in an earnest desire for the future. Intrepid, this means that in a sense he never really reached maturity, that he remained a slave to his impulses and emotions, that he detested the ordinary business of life and could not adapt himself to it, that his mind was full of dreams of ideal beauty and perfection, that his whole soul yearned to attain the highest pleasures of artistic creation. He was perpetually a deeply agitated soul. As such, it was natural he should outwardly seem irritable, impatient, restless, discontented, and solitary. It is impossible to believe that there was any strain of real evil in Poe. A man who could inspire such devotion as he had from such a woman as Mrs. Clem, a man who loved flowers and children and animal pets, who could be so devoted as a husband, who could so consecrate himself to art, was not a bad man. Yet his acts were often, as we have seen, most reprehensible, frequently the subject of a slander. He was not a victim of conspiracy to defame. Although circumstances were many times against him, he was his own worst enemy. He was cursed with a temperament. His mind was analytical and imaginative, and gave no thought to the ethical. He remained wayward as a child. The man, like his art, was not immoral, but simply unmoral. Whatever his faults, he suffered frightfully for them, and his fame suffered after him. I think that brought each and every one of us a little bit closer and deeper into the world of the legendary Edgar Allan Poe. His mind seemed so ethereal compared to the times back then, compared to the ordinary life of people back then. And I think that's something many of us artists, musicians, poets, songwriters, sculptors, and more could relate to. There's often a different kind of reality we may perceive, and not everyone in the real world may understand it, but either way, it can be there to communicate, to tell a story, to send a message, to warn, to infer, to inspire, to even terrify. And with that, my loves, I hope this leaves you feeling pensive, inspired, and drawn to learn more about our historical figures. I now wish you a pleasant night's sleep, and I'll see you all in the next video. Sleep well.